Whether it's consuming ground-up human remains as medicine or just straight-up eating somebody's arm, cannibalism has meant different things to different cultures, and people have been eating other people since forever. Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to May's Mortem. Today I wanted to do something just a little bit more freeform and discuss cannibalism as a whole and how it's changed forms throughout history. Before we start, I need to make a disclaimer that this video is for educational purposes. Viewer discretion is advised because we'll be discussing cannibalism, obviously, and also you should probably not eat people. Just gonna put that one in there. Also, here's a shot of my outfit for today. Nobody else was home to help me film this part, so I just did it in my mirror. Hope that's okay. Now that we've got all of that out of the way, I'll pour the tea and we can get into it. Let's go. So let's talk briefly about the history of the word cannibal. Whenever Christopher Columbus first got to the New World, he met the Caribs, the indigenous people of the Caribbean. And Carib was what they called themselves, and in their native language, Carib means brave ones. But after multiple different accounts from colonists and explorers, the word Carib eventually evolved into cannibal. And after this, the word cannibal became almost like a default word to describe the indigenous peoples of the Americas. There are more in-depth videos about this on YouTube, so if you want some more detail on that, I can link them in the description below for you. But I just wanted to give you guys kind of like a base level understanding of where it came from. So now that we know the word cannibal came from Europeans living in the New World, let's talk about cannibalism in Europe. In Western culture in general, cannibalism is seen as extremely taboo. I find it difficult myself to imagine wanting to eat another person. Most people who are also from the Western world would likely agree with me, but it's not always something that they turn their noses up at. Back in 1999 in France, they actually found the oldest fossil evidence of cannibalism in the world. In a cave, paleontologists found 100,000-year-old bones belonging to 6 Neanderthals that apparently had been cut up and cooked for human consumption. They found that their bone marrow and brains had been removed. And there were actually also marks on the bones that showed somebody that had a knife or another tool came through and cut the meat off the bones for cooking. It's been suggested that they were eaten by Homo sapiens, people like you and me, but there are also scholars who believe that Neanderthals were often eating each other before they died out. There's evidence of this in Spain where the bones of about 12 people were discovered having been eaten by Neanderthals. It seems like they died about 50,000 years ago, which is much more recent than the last ones we mentioned. And even more recent than this, around the 11th century, there are multiple striking examples of cannibalism. Historic and religious documents describe people cutting up and selling human meat for eating in marketplaces during famine or other difficult times. There are also striking numbers of first-hand accounts of cannibalism during the Crusades, perpetrated by European soldiers against Muslims. One incident was from around 1098 when Christian soldiers had captured the city of Mara in Syria. After they captured the city, there are multiple accounts of the soldiers going in and butchering and eating the Muslims that lived there. The reasons for this cannibalism aren't exactly clear. No one really knows why it happened. Some people believe that maybe there was famine in the troops, like they weren't really giving them enough food. But other people believe that these cannibalistic acts were actually encouraged by the soldiers' higher-ups because they wanted scary stories to instill fear in their enemies. And while a lot of people did write about this particular occurrence, it's not the only time that it happened. Either way, after the Crusades ended, the people in Europe were kind of disgusted with themselves. They didn't really feel like cannibalism fit in with their whole vibe, I guess. They wanted to be able to revel in the supposed success of the Crusades, but they also didn't want to face the reality of what they had done. In the Middle Ages, it was very popular to depict your foreign enemies as giants or witches or dog-faced men or cannibals. But having to face the reality that their soldiers, their fellow Christian countrymen, were cannibals was not something that they could stomach. By the 16th century in Europe, cannibalism has taken a whole new form. It was popular to consume human remains as cures for certain ailments. A well-known form of this is mummia. Mummia is ground-up, powdery, mummified remains taken from mummies brought over to Europe from Egypt. But with mummies being as rare as they were also expensive. So people began ingesting the remains of people who had died locally in their towns. The whole idea was that they would eat certain parts of the body depending on what they were sick with. Like if you had epilepsy, you would ground up skull bone fragments, mix it into molasses, and then eat it. It even got to the point where people would seek out fresh, still warm blood from somebody who had recently died, believing that if the blood was still warm, it still held a part of their life force and thus their soul. So if you were sick and you ingested this blood, it would give you their power. It was actually kind of viewed as a cure-all. So in Europe during this time, if you had been sick at any point, you had likely eaten a part of somebody. But also in Europe, people were using cannibalism as an excuse to conquer the new worlds of North and South America, saying the indigenous people living there were cannibals and thus in need of conquest. In actuality, it's not impossible that people in Europe were actually consuming more human remains than people in the New World. The whole situation was fairly hypocritical in reality. Cannibalism did happen in the New World, but it's not as widespread as the conquerors would have you think it was. It was mostly just a thinly veiled excuse used by explorers to obtain funding and social acceptance from religious aristocrats so that they could go on these expeditions. So now that we know cannibalism wasn't that prevalent in the New World, when did it actually happen? Because it did happen, just not in the way that you would think. Most people envision the act of cannibalism being a barbaric and violent affair, but in reality, it was really only used for rituals or times of famine, so really only when they absolutely had to. To me, the most striking form that it took was funerary cannibalism. Until about the 20th century, the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea and the Amazon actually practiced funerary cannibalism. When someone in their tribe would die, it was seen as an act of affection and respect towards the dead individual for the loved ones to eat the body in its entirety. It's also a way for the people who were left behind to cope with their loss. For some individual tribes, it's also seen as a good way to dispose of the body, because to them and in their belief systems, they believe that if you leave a body out in the open, or if you just bury a body, that leaves it open to being possessed by bad spirits. So they eat the body to prevent this. In one account that I read describing these funerary rituals, the people having to eat the deceased body of their loved one were either crying or showing other emotional signs of loss or grief. And one person even went out to the woods to vomit and then came back to finish eating the body. They weren't eating the body because they were depraved or evil, they were doing it because that's what their loved one wanted, because this is the only way they feel after death they can keep their loved one's spirit safe. It's just one more thing that they could do for their dead loved one before they let them go. And now that we're talking about specifically eating dead people, we get to talk about mellified men. A mellified man is described by Wikipedia as a human mummy confection, which honestly makes it sound like so much fun. I'll walk you through the process. The earliest records of mellified men come out of China and Assyria. Specifically in China, it was viewed as a way for old people to do something useful with their bodies after they died. They would donate their bodies to be mellified before their deaths. And the process of being mellified is actually pretty similar to the idea of sokushinbutsu, which I did do a video on. I can link that up above for you. Such an old video now, I feel like that was a million years ago. Anyways, if you felt like you were coming to the end of your life, if you so chose, you could start the process of mellification. You would start this process by eating nothing but honey. You would also sometimes go so far as to even bathe in it. They said that towards the end of this process, while you were still alive, you would be pooping and sweating honey, which is kind of gross, but okay. Honey is also not exactly a balanced diet, so you would eventually die from this. So you've died, and there's honey all built up in your body, and so they lay your honey-filled body into a coffin and then fill that coffin with honey as well. You are essentially entombed in honey. The coffin would then be sealed up and left somewhere to ferment for about 100 years, and then at the end of this 100 years, your body would have decomposed into a goo, essentially. And honey never spoils, so it's actually supposed to be a really good way to preserve a gooey body. Side note, there are also multiple accounts of people being mummified in honey, just like in general, not necessarily to become a mellified man. Anyways. So after this 100 years, they would remove your gooey self from this coffin and sell it in jars at the market, saying that it could cure anything from intestinal illnesses to broken bones. If you do want to become a gooey little guy after you pass, I've got bad news. There is no archaeological evidence of mellified men ever existing. It doesn't mean that they never happened, but it does mean that there's no physical evidence of any kind. So that means you won't get to eat sugary dude goo anytime soon. You're gonna have to heal your bones slow like the rest of us. While cannibalism is shocking to us, even to me still, we need to remember that it's just something that happens in other cultures, and sometimes we're not really meant to understand. It's not my or your place to say whether or not it's right or wrong. I grew up and live in America, and my worldview has developed a certain way because of this. It's important to step out of our shoes and try and see the world differently, even if it's a little shocking at first. I don't think I'll be eating people anytime soon though, for medicinal purposes or otherwise. I think the only thing I didn't cover in this video was criminal cannibalism, but maybe that's a whole other video for another time. I feel like this video was a little bit short, but it was a very fun topic for me and I hope you learned something new today. Please hit like and subscribe. I'm still just a new YouTuber, so it really helps me out a lot. I'll see you again next week, okay guys? Bye! Also, my name is Mayfield. I forgot again. My name is Mayfield. Mayfield is my name.